Hi, so today I will be discussing on the 4 conventional methods of the antimicrobial susceptibility testing. The widespread use of antibiotics has led to the development of antibiotic resistance among bacteria. Antimicrobial susceptibility testing has been developed to detect the antibiotic resistance or susceptibility of bacterial strains. And such tests are performed in the clinical microbiology laboratory to aid clinicians in choosing appropriate antibiotics for the treatment of patients. In this module, we will discuss the 4 conventional methods of antimicrobial susceptibility testing, namely Kirby-Bauer agar disc diffusion test, Stokes agar disc diffusion test, the Etest, and the Broth Microdilution test. Without further ado, let's get started.
Materials and apparatus. To perform disc diffusion, Etest, and Broth Microdilution, the following materials and apparatus are needed. Sterile warm Mueller-Hinton agar plate or a sterile warm Mueller-Hinton blood agar plate. The agar surface must be dry prior to beginning the procedure. Other types of agar may be used depending on guideline recommendations for specific organisms. Sterile, disposable cotton swabs. Appropriate antibiotic impregnated discs. Etest strips with appropriate antibiotics. Sterile normal saline. Sterile inoculating loop. McFarland densitometer to prepare a 0.5 McFarland bacterial suspension. Sterile forceps. Vortex mixer. Culture of test organism with pure, isolated single colonies on an agar plate. Pipettes. 96 well plate. Solution basin. Making an inoculum. To perform antimicrobial susceptibility using these methods, single colonies growing on solid agar are emulsified in normal saline. Mix the suspension by vortexing and measure turbidity using the densitometer. If the reading is less than 0.5 McFarland, add more colonies of the organism into the suspension. If the reading is more than 0.5 McFarland, add more sterile saline to the suspension. Repeat until a 0.5 McFarland turbidity reading is achieved. 0.5 McFarland is roughly equivalent to 1.5 times 10 to the power of 8 colony-forming units per milliliter. Kirby-Bauer disc diffusion. Perform the Kirby-Bauer disc diffusion using the following procedure. Dip a sterile cotton swab into the suspension adjusted to 0.5 McFarland. Wring out excess liquid from the cotton swab by pressing it against the inner wall of the suspension container. Swab the Mueller-Hinton agar surface in 3 directions with 60-degree rotations until the entire agar surface has been covered to form a uniform log. Using sterile forceps, place antibiotic discs on the agar surface. Incubate at 37 degrees Celsius for 18 to 24 hours. After the appropriate incubation time, measure the diameter of the zone of inhibition surrounding each antibiotic disc. Report the results as susceptible, intermediate, or resistant according to the guideline used. Always refer to information leaflets, manufacturer instructions, and recognized guidelines for the correct information on the materials used in your test. Stokes disc diffusion. Perform the Stokes disc diffusion using the following procedure. Using a marker pen and ruler, a pre-dried cation adjusted Mueller-Hinton agar plate is divided into two halves. The two inocula are to be streaked evenly across each half of the plate respectively, leaving a distance of not more than 5 mm between the two bacteria. To prepare a bacterial lawn, a sterile cotton swab is dipped into the suspension adjusted to 0.5 McFarland. Excess inoculum is removed by rotating the swab while pressing it against the inner wall of the tube above the fluid level. The agar is then streaked with the swab in a left to right and right to left motion until half of the plate is streaked. The streaking is repeated with the second suspension on the other half of the plate. Using a pair of sterile forceps, an antibiotic impregnated disc is placed at the center of the gap between the two bacterial lawns. The plate is sent for incubation at a desired temperature for an appropriate period of time, depending on the organisms tested. After incubation, inhibition zone diameters are measured in millimeters using a ruler. Compared to the standard Kirby-Bauer test, Stokes disc diffusion allows a more direct comparison of antimicrobial susceptibility patterns between two bacteria. Etest. The Etest allows for the determination of the minimum inhibitory concentration, MIC, of an antibiotic for a bacterium. Perform the Etest using the following procedure. Dip a sterile cotton swab into the suspension adjusted to 0.5 McFarland. Wring out excess liquid from the cotton swab by pressing it against the inner wall of the suspension container. Swab the Mueller-Hinton blood agar surface in 3 directions with 60-degree rotations until the entire agar surface has been covered to form a uniform lawn. Using sterile forceps, place the Etest strip in the middle of the agar surface. Incubate at 37 degrees Celsius for 18 to 24 hours. After the appropriate incubation time, note the MIC value at the point at which the growth touches the strip. Interpret the result according to the guideline used. In this example shown here, the bacterial growth intercepts the Etest strip in a black section, whereby the antibiotic concentration is in between 0.5 and 1 mg per liter. Following the manufacturer guidelines, the MIC is read as the value in the next white section above where the growth has intercepted the strip. In this case, the MIC is interpreted as 1 mg per liter. Broth Microdilution. To set up a broth microdilution experiment, a 96-well plate is filled with sterile cation adjusted Mueller-Hinton broth, except for the wells in the first column. The wells in the first column are then filled with the broth containing a desired concentration of antibiotic, for example at 64 mg per liter. Using a multi-channel pipette, a serial two-fold dilution of the antibiotic is performed until the 11th column of the 96-well plate. Pipette up and down to mix. Change tips after each round of mixing. The wells in the 12th column are to be used for viability control. Up to 4 antibiotics can be tested in the same plate for one bacterial strain, each antibiotic to be tested in duplicate. Or up to 4 bacterial strains can be tested in the same plate for each antibiotic, each strain to be tested in duplicate. Or up to 4 antibiotics can be tested for up to 4 bacterial strains in the same plate, each bacterium antibiotic pair to be tested in duplicate. The test organism is prepared as a suspension in broth and adjusted to 0.5 McFarland, which is equivalent to 1.5 times 10 to the power of 8 colony-forming units per milliliter. This suspension is then diluted and added into each well to give a final concentration of 5 times 10 to the power of 5 colony-forming units per milliliter. The volume of the inoculum added should be less than 10% of the total broth volume in each well. For example, if there is 100 microliters of broth in a well, 10 microliters of inoculum is added. If there is 200 microliters of broth in a well, 20 microliters of inoculum is added. The inoculated plate is incubated at a desired temperature and for a suitable period of time, depending on the organism tested. After incubation, the well plate is inspected by unaided eyes. The minimum inhibitory concentration, or MIC, of every test organism is read. The MIC is defined as the lowest antibiotic concentration which inhibits visible growth of bacteria. The MICs can be interpreted according to the values recommended by international expert committees such as the Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute, CLSI, or European Committee on Antimicrobial Susceptibility Testing, EUCAST. For example, this is the EUCAST tetracycline breakpoints for Staphylococcus species. Any strains with MICs less than or equal to 1 mg per liter are considered as susceptible to tetracycline, while those with MICs more than 2 mg per liter are considered resistant. In row H, the Staphylococcus aureus isolate has a MIC of 4 mg per liter. Since the MIC is more than 2 mg per liter, this isolate is resistant to tetracycline.
So I hope you guys find this video useful for your studies.